Next up, we're going to talk about Figma. I'm going to introduce to the stage Weavely with Florian Myter to talk about how to enhance these surveys and make it very interactive for the user. Welcome.
All right, thanks a lot for the introduction, Gabby, and thanks a lot for attending my talk, everybody. So, like Gabby said, I'm here to talk about empowering marketeers with interactive online forms. But I'm first going to start by telling you the story of sort of how we got into interactive online forms to begin with, because that's sort of part of the story that I want to tell. So I actually come from a completely different background, so I'm not from an insights background or a marketing background. I did a PhD in computer science with my co-founder, yesterday on the left of the screen. And so we were what you can consider to be sort of professional software developers, but even for us, we always found it way too tedious to go from like an idea to working software. We would start the way that everybody starts, so you sketch out something on paper or you design an interface, and then at some point we always wished we had a magic wand, right, which you can just wave at that interface that you just sort of hand-drawn and get working software out of it. But of course that's not how the way the world works. You need to go through the itty-gritty, start programming, release, test, debug, and go back and cycle. And so we ended our PhDs, we finished our PhDs, is a better way of putting it, and we figured, okay, we have all of this knowledge, we have all of these technological artifacts that we've built up through our research. Can we actually try to tackle that problem? Can we provide that magic wand and enable people to just draw out what they want and generate software out of it? And so we set out to basically tackle that problem. And as is usually the case when you start a company, you quickly figure out that you had it maybe you saw it a bit too big, and your ambitions were a bit too high. Because basically generating sort of production-ready software out of an interface, that's pretty difficult. There's a lot to take into consideration when you generate production-ready software. It needs to be foolproof and scalable, etc. And so we toned it down and we focused on the beginning of the life cycle of product development, so basically prototyping. So you have a sketch of what you want to have a prototype so you can go out in the field and test with users. It doesn't need to be completely foolproof and with all of the bells and whistles, but it needs to be workable enough to gather insights. And so we figured, let's build a prototyping platform and use that as a means to figure out what people want to use that magic wand for. So if you give people the ability to generate software from a design, what is it? What kind of software do they want to build? And so we built this prototyping platform on top of Figma. So quick show of hands, who's heard of Figma before? Right, that's the good sort of half of the public. Who's actually used Figma before? Okay, that's let's say that's a half of the half. So for those of you that don't know Figma, for all intents and purposes, it's Microsoft Paint, but sort of on steroids. So I know Figma users love Figma, so I don't want to offend anybody, but essentially it's a drawing tool. So you want to design an interface, it allows you to design that interface freehand in a digital environment, of course. It's really well made for that specific purpose, and so we were built on top of that. So you design your interface, our platform takes your interface, and it generates software with minimal configuration. That's the screenshot that you're seeing, so without having to code. We launched that in the beginning of 2020, and we reached about sort of 4,000 users across 100 plus countries. So we had a good sample size of what people wanted to do with this prototypical magic wand that we've built. And so what we found out, surprisingly, is that most of the people were using our tool to build surveys and forms. And we're surprised for two reasons. So first of all, why would you still want to build a form or a survey if you have all of these other form builders out there, right? So there's a lot of here representatives. You have SurveyMonkey, you have Zoho, you have Google Forms, you have your Typeforms. Why would you want to use our tool to build a form and a survey? And specifically, why would you use a prototyping platform to build out a survey? So people weren't just prototyping the form to test it out with users and see, does it convert? Do people understand the questions? But they were actually sending out those surveys and collecting responses from that. So we had 80% of our paying users and a good 30% of all of our users using our platforms to do this, while we envisioned people building mobile apps. We had those users as well, right? Building mobile apps, interactive maps, websites, all of this was possible as well, but the majority of people were interested in surveys. And so we were taken aback by this. This was sort of the last thing that we would have expected. And we started into this journey and figuring out why is it that people want to build surveys in a prototyping platform. And so from a gut feeling, the idea was, maybe it's because of aesthetics and design, right? Figma is a design platform. There's an overlap between UX designers and sort of market research, and so maybe it's a design thing. Maybe people want to design forms in Figma. And of course, this sort of it's a mimicky slide, right? It's easy to mock interfaces of forms the way they were used to build in the 90s. At some point, like in 30 years from now, people will look at the interfaces we have today and do the same thing. But this gut feeling, I think everybody has it. Typeform had this great ad running, I think, a couple of years back, where you would see a form designed in Comic Sans, and a lady would say, like, surveys like this get responses like that, and you would see somebody type in gibberish into an input field. And so, from your gut, it makes sense that the aesthetics of your form might have an impact on your response rate, might have an impact on the quality of your data. But the scientist in me, sort of the part of me that's still scientist, wanted to figure out, besides the marketing sort of argument of Typeform, and besides that gut feeling, is there also actual research that goes into that direction, that showcases that yes, there is an impact of aesthetics on surveys and on the quality of data you get back. And so, of course, from a UX perspective, the Nielsen Norman Group that does extensive research on the impact of UX and UI on web applications in general, but I wanted to figure out for surveys specifically. So there's quite some research, as it turns out. Some of the more interesting one done at Washington State University, where they designed an experiment with a single questionnaire. So they had same kind of questions, the same kind of structure, but they had two variants on it. One was aesthetically pleasing, one was aesthetically displeasing. So I hope that's rather obvious. So the aesthetically pleasing one is the top one. Or aesthetically neutral would be one way of saying it, of course. And the aesthetically displeasing one is the bottom one. So they played around with color contrasts to make it sort of as ugly as possible, basically. Fonts difference and don't match up. Stuff gets it's difficult to get rid. So they made two versions of the same questionnaire, one pretty and one ugly, to put it dumbly. And so the results are, of course, not Typeform marketing. So it's more nuanced than saying, like, of course, the more prettier form outperforms the ugly form on all aspects. That's not the case for all of the categories. But so what they did is they looked at responses, volume, response rates, omissions, and that kind of stuff, and they categorized according to different categories. And on average, of course, the aesthetically pleasing one outperforms the aesthetically displeasing one. And in the categories, there's a tie, but it never underperforms, right? So it never hurts to make an aesthetically pleasing form. That's at least the baseline. Some things I did expect some results. So, for example, in the aesthetically displeasing one, people were 1.5 times more likely to omit items. So in fields that were not required, of course. Sort of makes sense. You get an ugly form. If people don't spend the time making their form look and behave good, then why would you spend the time in answering it? So that was something that I did expect. More interestingly, if people were asked to rate something, so for example, a Likert scale, the aesthetically displeasing one, people gave negatively skewed answers. And that's extremely interesting, or that was sort of surprising to me, because it showcases that there's not only an impact in the way that people interact with your form, but it's also the kind of responses that they will give. And so the design of your form, from an aesthetic point of view, might actually influence also the responses that you get and bias your responses to one side or to the other. And this correlates or coincides with other research that I found as well, which showcases, for example, a correlation between text inputs, so the text input box size and the response volume. So up until a certain point, of course, the bigger you make your input area box, the higher your response volume is going to be. And so aesthetics has a big impact on your response rate, the kind of data that you get in, and the quality of your data. And you can see these up until the very details of your forms. So Kantar did a study on the impact of visuals and the usage of visuals in surveys. And they found that on average, 50% more facts were recalled by respondents if they used the appropriate visual. And again, this is sort of science and not marketing, so there's the nuance is always important to figure out. And the nuance here is in this word appropriate. And then the question is, of course, like, what's an appropriate visual? And to give you an example, they asked respondents whether or not they drank smoothies. Same question, two variants, one with a visual, which was an icon of a blender, and one without. So without the visual, 12% of the people responded that they didn't drink smoothies, while with the icon, only 6% answered, yes, I do drink smoothies, which in itself is rather surprising. You would imagine a visual having an impact on the way that people respond, but going from single to double, that's strange. And so they decided to investigate why does this visual change our responses that much. And as it turns out, there's a lot of people that drink smoothies, but they don't specifically make them themselves. So they go off in the shop, they buy it in a bottle or in a can or whatever, but they don't make them. And so of course, if you show somebody that never makes a smoothie an icon of a blender, that sort of that's not correlated for them. Like a blender and a smoothie, those two things, they have nothing to do with each other. And you might even interpret the question in the wrong way. So if you go over the question quickly, do you drink a smoothie, and you see a blender, you might interpret it as being, do you drink a smoothie and do you make it yourself, or do you drink a smoothie out of a blender? And so the visuals that you use impact your responses. And so one, it's important to design aesthetically pleasing forms, but two, it's important to make sure that in those aesthetic elements that you use, that you don't bias the respondents to one side or to the other, of course, which is easier said than done, because in hindsight it's always easy to investigate, but up front that's difficult to figure out. So you have aesthetics for your survey quality, but as I sort of stepped into that journey of design and survey, I talked to a lot of people that use surveys day in, day out. And I also noticed that there's, besides the pure quality, also the engagements with non-digital population segments. So of course, we're talking about accessibility. Most survey builders today have at least meet the WCAG, so the Web Accessibility Guidelines, to some extent. But designing your survey and the design of your survey also has a huge impact on engaging, especially non-digital populations. So if you have kids, or if you have older people, or people that are not used to using digital tools, the design of your survey might have a huge impact on response rates and data quality again. And so I was talking to this UX researcher, Sukada, which works at Baiju. And it's an interesting case because Baiju is an Indian edtech, and so she spends most of her time doing research with kids. Which is not easy. So she has a hard time getting them into a lab and doing qualitative sort of in-person research because there's a lot of extremely strict guidelines around that. The timeline is also difficult to match with children. So most of the time she does quantitative and survey work. But even then it's rather tricky for two main reasons, she said. First of all, you wouldn't sort of believe the amount of memes that she gets back from kids in her surveys, but that's just sort of kids being kids. There's nothing you can do about that. But the second thing is that they have an extremely short attention span. That's always the case for kids, but I think it's only getting worse with sort of TikTok and all of the mobile stuff nowadays. And so she said, like, sending out a Google form, which there's no way going around it. A Google form, it's as bland and as boring as it gets. It's really tough to keep that attention of those kids. So at some point they'll drop off, they'll start sending even more memes, and your quality of your survey goes down drastically. And so in talking to her and in talking to our users, and that's where I cycle back to the fact that people were building surveys using our prototyping tool, I sort of noticed that from a design perspective, if you're building surveys today, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. So on the one hand, on the left-hand side, you have your quick and easy solutions, your Google Forms, extremely fast to set up a survey, but you're extremely limited from a design perspective, whether that's UX and flow or aesthetics. You can also move to the right side, so you can go for the high-end tools like your type forms. You get blocks that are good looking and that work well out of the box, but you're still rather limited in what you can do. You can't make crazy surveys, crazily tailored, because at some point you're stuck with whatever type form provides you as building blocks, or you need to start basically coding, do custom CSS, but at that point in time you're coding again, and that's not the point of these no-code tools. So it's hard to find a survey builder which allows you to make stuff as custom as you want, so really let loose that creativity to build a survey. And the second trend that we see is this use of Figma, so that's this design tool that I was talking about. That's a marketeer using Figma, so it's a drawing tool, right? But besides user interfaces, people are starting to use Figma to basically design whatever. So graphics, these are social media posts from a marketeer, interfaces, etc. And so the reason why people were building surveys in our prototyping tool is because for some surveys, you need something which needs to look like it was custom coded for you, but without having to program it explicitly because you're a marketeer or UX researcher and not a programmer. And so we decided to not abandon our prototyping idea, but to refocus and rebuild a new product which is specifically made for that form case. So essentially, you type in AI what you want to do, what you want as insights or what the survey is about. It will generate you a generic survey with a generic design. And you can then harness the full power of Figma to tailor it whatever way you want. So you want to add images, you want to change the colors, you want to change how all of those questions are set up or add different pages. You do all of that in Figma, it's freehand. And then our platform will take that survey, generate a web application out of that, and you can send it around, embed it on the website, and collect responses. So this isn't sort of a sales pitch or even a demo. I have a workshop coming up this afternoon at 12:20 on this stage. So if you're interested, I'll give you more of an idea of how that works in practice. But so there's two major benefits to using Figma essentially as a UI editor for your surveys. One is that you're limitless in your design capabilities. So whatever you can design in Figma, which is more or less anything, you can turn that into a working form. And so for people like Sukada, that means being able to really tell a story across your survey, captivate those kids, basically immerse them in an experience and not only providing them with a survey, but it also means, given that you're using Figma, that you can collaborate from a design perspective with any other colleague. So you can join in, build a survey collaboratively, and then publish it. And a second benefit, of course, is that you're lightningly fast when it comes to A/B testing. So you can tweak every single minor detail of your survey, do A/B testing, send them out to variant auditors, see what the response rate is like, what people answer, what works and what doesn't, and then finally pick one version and send it out massively to your respondents. To give you an idea of how that works, we did a case with Immerscope. So it's a Flemish real estate platform, so you're able to rent or buy property that they have on listing. It's rather standard. The start of their customer journey is a form, right? I think I'm more and more convinced that 80% of software is actually just forms in some way or another. Start of the journey, it's a form, you enter the criteria of the house you're looking to buy or the home you're looking to buy or rent, and then it matches that with the database. And they were redesigning that form. They had two variants, an A variant which was very simple, very basic, a B variant with a lot of filters, a lot of input fields to really go into the details of what you were looking for. And they wanted to know up front, should we spend the development time into that B design or should we stick to the A design? So they had an audience of around 100 respondents, all based in Antwerp. They knew for a fact that these people were looking for a house. And the research or the experiment was set up in such a way that they wanted to test in real life conditions. So they didn't want to invite them into their lab and have a prototype running there, because most people browse for houses sort of on the toilet, it's funny but true, in the subway, that kind of stuff. So they wanted to recreate that environment as much as possible. And so essentially send out a survey linked to their data in an A/B format and test what would work and how people would navigate those new designs. So they built that form using our platform, and they quickly realized that, first of all, the B form was mostly unused, like those additional filters were mostly unused. So that always shows that it's not because you have the sort of the intuition that yes, people will look into like very fine-grained details for homes that the actual user is going to use those features. So the A form outperformed vastly the B form, which saved them a lot of development hours. But they also noticed some sort of quirks of how people use their tool in general, meaning that most people don't even search for a lot of things in the beginning, so they just enter where they want their house or their home to be. They look at the results, then they cycle back, they refine their search, and they continue. So there's sort of ping pong effect, which they were able to witness with this sort of prototype form. A second case, which goes more into the direction of Sukada and telling a story in your survey, is the Zobite case. So it's a survey by Italian art students, which kind of shows based on the design. So they were doing this AR/VR exposition, and they needed a survey before the exposition to ask questions to the audience, and then tailor that experience, that AR/VR experience, based on the results. And so, of course, if you're doing an artsy AR/VR exposition, you don't want a Google form to ask to the respondents. And so they designed this story, and you literally see a storyline through the survey as you go from the heavens down into a wood. There's, besides the questions, there's sort of contextual elements to it that really immerse you into the survey. And this is exactly the kind of stuff that you need when you're surveying kids, for example. You're telling a story, it's interactive, it looks fun. This is the kind of stuff that you aren't able to do in a Google form. Of course, it takes a while to design this, but at that point in time, it's a return on investment compared to the responses that you get from your survey. And I believe in general that that's where the industry is going towards. So I'm not going to beat a dead horse and sort of sell AI, because I mean everybody's talking about AI, using AI, doing AI now. But in the last year we've talked about generative AI for sort of images and text, or helping you do your research. But I think the more fundamental part of it, or at least from my perspective, is the fact that generating text or generating software code is also one of the abilities of AI. And so combining AI and no code, we're able to build custom software without having to program anything. So anybody will have the possibility to generate really immersive experiences, custom experiences for the respondents, without having to rely on standardized building blocks, which in some cases are great. If you want to go fast, you use standardized building blocks. But if you want to have something really custom made, this whole AI trend will enable you to go to the absolute top level and generate custom code for your surveys, for your forms, without having to rely on slow and expensive software development. That sort of wraps up the story and the point that I wanted to make. So if you think that what I said was nonsense, feel free to send me an email, or if you have any other questions, of course. You can try out our form builder for free. We're in beta, so we're looking for feedback. So by all means, if you're a Figma user or you know a Figma user, try it out and provide me some feedback. Of course, this is an insights conference, and so the insights that I'm looking for here on the stage is sort of feedback on the talk that I gave, what went well, what could I have done better. And so you have this lovely QR code here. Of course, you can scan it and provide feedback on my talk. Quick word of warning, it's been designed in Figma and built in Weebly, of course. I'm not a designer. You'll notice that immediately when you open up the form. I'm a programmer, so I make stuff work, but it's ugly, usually. I have prettier surveys coming up for my workshop, so if you're looking for pretty forms, then please come back at 12:20, and we'll talk in a bit more of an interactive manner. If there's any question now, of course, I'll be happy to take them as well.
Hello.
I just need the... Oh, I need the headset, actually. Yep. Thanks.
Hello,
Yep.
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you,
hi.
thanks.
Yeah, very interesting. Love the presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question. You at the end you mentioned it's custom code. So yeah, many companies are always looking for better practices and reuse existing templating and themes. Is that something that's possible, or do you always it's always a one-off design of a survey?
So I think reusability in this case, you can see it on two levels. One level is reusability of your existing design language, where the whole Figma thing sort of kicks into another notch. Most people have their branding assets, their design systems in Figma today. So building your surveys in Figma allows you to reuse all of that existing design work that your designers or marketeers have previously done to build your survey. So that's one thing. And from a coding perspective, the code that we generate is always a one-off for the moment. So we're looking to see how do people want to integrate that code into existing products or existing websites, and to what extent can we leverage the use of AI to match the code that we generate with the code that your developers would write. Because I think that's the major challenge today. It's not so much generating code anymore, because the algorithms have got really good at that. But of course, that code that you generate, you want it to look as if it's been written by a member of your team. So it needs to sort of read in the same way, the same documentation, and that kind of stuff. And for that, you need to actually have an existing code base as an example to tailor that generated code, which isn't the case for the moment.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, well, thanks a lot for attending the talk, everybody. Feel free to join my workshop later on, or ask me a question around the coffee machine. Always happy to have a chat. Have a nice day. Bye.